You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, Kristen Webster returns as we continue talking about movies with ambiguity. Here we go. Welcome back to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me today, fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau, and we're talking to returning guest Kristen Webster, who's been on the Fan2Fan Podcast before and graciously decided to come back on. Kristen, we've talked about Muholland Drive, Donnie Darko, tour theory, and your background is in film editing, but you teach film studies classes, foreign cinema. So in part one, we began our conversation about movies with ambiguity. We talked about directors, including Christopher Nolan, Hitchcock, Neil LaBute, movies like Interstellar, Inception, Oppenheimer, The Shining, The Graduate, Shape of Things, 2001, how these movies made us feel, whether they had a definitive ending or left a bit of a cliffhanger, whether it was emotional, whether it was intentional or not. Kristen made her case, especially from her unique perspective as a teacher, an educator with film students, currently talking to film students that have a different perspective, a different lens when they're looking at films, and specifically when we're talking about things like ambiguity. Was that Marcellus Wallace's soul in the suitcase in Pulp Fiction? Does it matter? As long as Tarantino told us a good story, maybe that's all that matters. Who cares if it was ambiguous, as long as it was good? So let's continue our conversation with Kristen. Pete, take it away.
Well, let's, we've been trying to tackle this question of ambiguity for a while, but Kristen, I know that you've got a couple of films specifically that you wanted to talk about on this subject, a trio of French films by the director François Ozon. Bernie, I don't know if you have seen Swimming Pool, Young and Beautiful, and or Summer of '85. I personally have not.
That's 100% why I've been talking about every film that I have.
You've been delaying the inevitable?
And pretty much, yeah. And again, I think this is the best, this is maybe a Film Studies 103, Kristen, that we're going to title this episode. Because I think, again, like this is something that when you talked about auteur theory, when we last had you on, it was a concept that when you said it, I didn't know it as a name, but I knew it as like a concept. I'm like, oh, I think I know what you're talking about. Now I can see it.
Yeah.
And you created like the parameters. It's a perspective. It's, it's a point of view. Yeah. And then if you see that in multiple films, maybe that is telling you a little bit about the director, about the storyteller, what maybe is important to them. And I think that's where having you talk about films that are not films we're familiar with, especially the films you're going to talk about, not like the Pulp Fictions, but instead these French films. I'm interested to kind of see like, all right, how you're making the case for how these movies work with this, idea of ambiguity, or if they don't work.
So François Ozon, I saw Swimming Pool when it first came out in the theaters. I think I lived in Los Angeles when Swimming Pool came out. I think it was like 2002, 2003, I think. I'm almost positive. And I was, blown away by it. So first I want to say that to me, these three movies are sort of more what you were talking about, Bernie, and less of what I was talking about with ambiguity, in the sense that they do leave you feeling like, I want to talk about this with somebody because I want to get an idea of what did you think that meant? What do you think happened? But I didn't feel robbed. So it didn't bother me that there was a little bit of an ambiguous moment or piece to the ending. So Swimming Pool, it is a French-British film. Charlotte Rampling stars in it, and Ludivine Senier, I'm probably butchering her name, the French actress. It's a very simple story that really takes place in a country town in France. It's an aging British novelist who writes crime fiction, and she's trying to write her latest novel. She's struggling with ideas. So her publisher, who I believe she's been having an affair with, or she's had an affair with, tells her, go to my house in France. It's quiet. You'll be able to write. No one will disturb you. You'll get your next novel out of it. So she goes to the house in France. Everything seems great. But then the first night she's there, there's a disturbance. And it's this beautiful young woman, Julie, who is in the swimming pool. And she's causing a ruckus. And the writer basically insists on knowing, like, who are you? What are you doing here? This is my publisher John's home. And she's like, yes, I'm John's daughter. So, I'm coming to stay in the house kind of thing. And the writer's upset about it, but they have to live together for this short period of time because they're in the middle of nowhere and they can't, it's not fair to make one of them leave. So they kind of agree we're going to stay out of each other's way. It's a very interesting story because it's a simple story. It seems like a sort of a slice of life in a middle-aged woman's career. But then there comes a turn in the story where it becomes about a more in-depth look at what it feels like to be aging as a woman and look at a young woman and start feeling pangs of, I wish I looked like that. I wish I had that sexual freedom like she has. I wish I had all the things this young woman has. But then but I'm glad I have my maturity. I'm glad I have my sense because she's, such and such. But then there's a murder. And suddenly it becomes a murder mystery. And the writer who writes crime fiction starts really getting off on this and thinks that she can, hide the body and we can get away with it and et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to give everything away, but at the end of the movie, the story is wrapped up. Julie and the writer learn to respect each other, appreciate each other for who they are. And the writer goes back to London with the story, or a story for her publisher. And as she's leaving the publisher's office, because she kind of tells the publisher, you're a piece of shit. I know, I haven't been the only woman you've been with, whatever. And as she's leaving, a young blonde girl walks into the office who's much younger than Julie, who we've seen. She's probably 13. Julie was 22. And as she's leaving, I think the publisher says something to her, Julie. And Julie's like, hi, Dad, and runs over to him. And the writer turns around and kind of smiles. And then they cut to footage from France from earlier in the story. And it makes you ask, wait a minute, if that's Julie, who was the girl in France the whole time? Was this the story that the writer was creating in her mind and writing? Did any of that actually happen? But I have to say, it never bothered me. Now, I suggest everybody watch the 3 movies because François Ozon is an incredible modern, I don't want to, not modern, but contemporary auteur out of France. Beautiful movies. I mean, just visually everything about them they're beautiful. But you can really do a lot of research about the end of Swimming Pool. There are tons of theoretical essays, critical essays that just really talk about who is Julie, what happened with Julie. And then you kind of see a trend in his movies, Young and Beautiful. You definitely see a trend in thematic ideas, the idea of aging and youth and beauty, and the idea that youth is wasted on the young, beauty is wasted on youth. And also because they're French, there's a lot of sexuality and, the idea of sexuality in the movies. But in Young and Beautiful, it explores this teenager who turns to prostitution, but not in the way that we're used to seeing in American films where someone's, high on crack and needs to get a fix or whatever, and they're going to go quickly get some money on a corner. It's not like that. It's more an exploration of sexuality. But of course, there's the interlude of the older wife. And again, Charlotte Rampling's in it. She was kind of his muse, I think, for a while. And it just really does, that movie too, leaves you with ambiguity of, was that person real? Was that person who we thought, did she really do those things? And then Summer of '85 came out a few years ago. And I think you can watch it on Max or Showtime. And it's really beautiful. It's a story of 2 young men and their sexual exploration with each other. They're best friends. And one of them is very green and naive, and the other one is a little more, experienced. I really don't want to ruin anything about the movie because it's an incredible movie, but there's a death, there's a possible suicide, there's a possible murder, there's a possible accident, one of the 3. And at the end, there's this feeling of, wait a minute, did he die? Or was he responsible for the death? So there's questions. However, the way the stories are told, you don't feel like you've been cheated. Whereas I do feel like certain movies, especially, and I hate to say it's an American filmmaking thing, and maybe European filmmakers are better with their ambiguous storytelling. Maybe I'm not sure of that exactly, but I will say I know, like, I'm going to bring this up. David Lynch is a huge hero in the filmmaking community in America and around the world, as he should be. He's an incredible artist. I'm not saying anything negative about David Lynch, but when I saw Muholland Drive, I got to experience this in a very special way. He brought Muholland Drive to AFI. He let us watch it right before it came out. And then he did a Q&A, and it was for our master seminar class. And it was the first time I believe he'd been back, unless this is just folklore. But I think we all kind of were told it was the first time he'd been back since he was at AFI, because he didn't go back to AFI the second year. I mean, legend is that he wasn't asked back because his thesis project wasn't greenlit. I think it was Eraserhead, and they said it was too abstract. This is what I've heard. And so he, like Darren Aronofsky with Pi, it was the same story. He started at AFI but did not finish. But so he came with Muholland Drive, and I had seen some Twin Peaks episodes. My sister was obsessed with it when we were younger, so I watched it, loved the music, was a little scared of it actually when I was a kid, so I wasn't super into it. But I had seen Blue Velvet. I had a roommate when I first moved to LA who was obsessed with David Lynch, so he was quickly like slamming those movies, Wild at Heart, into my world. And Muholland Drive, I mean, I still to this day will watch it if I stumble on it. But I realize the reason I watch it is because of the aesthetic quality. And this is something that David Lynch does very well. It's a beautiful movie. His actors are beautiful. The music is eerie, unsettling, but it's still beautiful. But if you've seen Muholland Drive, you know that it's very confusing at the end. Wait a minute. People start morphing into other people. You don't know wait a minute, was Betty this person all along, or was she jealous? It's very, very confusing. And I remember when that movie was screened for us, it was one of the first master seminar classes we had. And there was always this kind of warning that we were not allowed to do certain things. Like, you can't ask for autographs. You can't try to ask for a job. You can't say, will you read my script? But there was also this idea that you have to be careful. Please don't criticize somebody to the point that it sounds like you're criticizing them. We were allowed to ask questions, but obviously don't be rude to David Lynch. And he did sit there and chain smoke. He was allowed to smoke inside the Harold Lloyd Master Seminar screening room. And in LA, you couldn't smoke in LA for like 40 years. So it was really interesting that he could smoke. I'm exaggerating. It's not 40 years, but it has been way over 20 years that you could smoke indoors. And somebody did get up the guts to ask him about the ending of the movie. And his answer was so it drove me nuts. And I know everyone else was like, oh my God, I love him. He's the coolest person on earth. But it really drove me nuts. And he kind of just said, I don't care if people are confused. And I thought, well, why did you make that movie then? I mean, really, why did you make that? I know that you shouldn't make a film for an audience. To me, it's a piece of art. You want to put it out in the world. However, I also do think, though, that movies are a very special type of art. They're meant to be experienced by people. If you don't care what people think in terms of being confused, that bothers me a little bit. I don't feel like you're fulfilling your role as the storyteller if you, one, create such a confusion at the end that the world is asking what happened, and then to say, I don't care. And I'm paraphrasing, and he may not have said it so directly. You can actually, I think, find the video of this online somewhere, because all of those were videoed and they're archived somewhere. But I just remember thinking, wow, I'd never really heard any filmmaker that big talk, I think, too. And when he said it, I was just like blown away that there are filmmakers that feel that way, that they just, and good on them. I mean, I'm sure Tarantino probably thinks that. I'm sure Christopher Nolan thinks that. I'm sure most filmmakers who have very complex stories feel that, and they understand they are going to alienate some audiences if people are confused.
I was going to ask you, do you think, this is a complete conjecture on my part, but do you think in that moment being questioned by
a young person,
film student, do you think it was just like him kind of giving like a fuck you answer to be like,
That's what I was thinking too, Pete.
You don't get to ask me. You don't get to ask me that.
Yeah.
So here's your answer. I don't care.
Yeah. It's like flippant. It's also a little abstract to kind of be like, the answer I'm going to give you is going to be that I'm not going to give you an answer. And then, Kristen, like you said, some people praise it. It's like, oh my God, you've just reinforced what I already thought about you. And then other people, maybe just you, Kristen, were just like, no, like unacceptable.
I don't know. And again, I feel bad because I probably should have gone back and watched it to really hear what he said. But I do remember when I heard it, I don't know. I don't think he was being flippant. I don't. I actually think he genuinely feels that way. And I kind of feel like that has to be the truth, because if you look at a lot of his work, if he cared, it wouldn't end the way it does. Or you wouldn't have like, who killed Laura Palmer?
Sure.
Why is that little person? Like, I feel like everything he did wouldn't have such a feeling of ambiguity if he did care.
Maybe for him, the ambiguity, the chaos, right? It's not a bug, it's a feature. Maybe it's part of his recipe, not a recipe that you may like, Kristen. You can look at it backwards and be like, oh, like I actually did plan for this because I planned to make you feel confused, because maybe with the plan comes satisfaction. Like you have to have both to make it work. If not, it doesn't work. And maybe that's something that David Lynch has kind of perfected a little bit for fans of his work, where that's the consistency in his voice, is that he gives you something that can feel noirish. When you're mentioning Twin Peaks, you could have this like Americana with a little bit of procedural type show, but then you can still have this quirkiness that some people are like, oh, that's just David Lynch. And he's like, no, guys, like that's a piece of me.
Yeah.
I'm completely just riffing off the top of my head with this, but it seems to me that a lot of his film work is a lot of like just stuff out of his subconscious. And it would be very personal to him. And for him, that may be the pure art form of like, this is what I've conjured out of here and I'm putting it out there. And I don't really want to comment on it too much. So you just make it what you will, which is fine. But I feel like that's a very different thing from someone like François Ozon, who clearly has a point of view and is clearly talking about something, whether it's, youth being wasted on the youth, beauty being wasted on the young, examining someone getting older further in their career. Like there seems to be more at play there that probably can be related to by a larger audience. I think David Lynch probably is the beneficiary of people being like, oh, this is just so out there, so it's got to be really cool and interesting. And because he doesn't give you a whole lot, it's so open to interpretation that people can feel that ownership of it. Like, oh, yes, I have this connection to Muholland Drive because this is what I think is going on, when there's really probably no real answer. And maybe to your point, like when he's like, I don't care, that just may be it. It just may be like, this is just from me, and this is my art, and it's out there, and I'm done with it. And it's, again, it's that slight variation of someone that has maybe a little bit more of a point, and the ambiguity comes in as a flourish to an overall story, as opposed to something that at the end, like you said, like Muholland Drive just is just, it just gets very confusing, and there's no real clues, and there's nothing there that sets you up to be like, well, it could be this, it could be like, there's really no roadmap to it.
Yeah.
The movie Swimming Pool reminded me of, have you guys heard of this movie called The Innocents?
Yes.
It's like a black and white movie that's kind of categorized as horror. I don't, maybe like 50s. It's in black and white. The short version is this woman is hired to take charge of these two children who live in this massive home. And it's very gothic. She shows up, she meets these children who are very quirky. Like I always remember there's a scene where the boy is on one of the parapets and he's got doves that are sitting on his head and his shoulders. The feeling of that was that he was kind of like a child of nature. Like that he was so in tune that the birds were willing to sit on him because he was so ethereal and like she was like, oh, this is just a quirky kid. But throughout the movie, these two ghosts keep showing up over and over and over again. And there's times where the woman who's gotten charge of these kids, she's like looking outside the window, the male ghost, Like you can almost imagine like he's on a skateboard and someone's pushing the skateboard because he's floating. Sure. He has that sort of kind of feel to it. There's probably a technical term for it. Mm-hmm. I think it's called skateboarding, but he's moving towards the thing. And like she looks, and as it's approaching, she turns away because she's frightened. And then she's interrupted by one of the servants. And when the servant comes in, the babysitter woman, she's looking in the mirror in the window and she's seeing her own expression. So it always left like these subtle feelings when you watch that movie that you're wondering, is she seeing ghost? Are the kids ghost? Or is she going mad? You know, she sees a female ghost crying at like a desk, and then she sits down. She feels emotional. I think the servant woman comes in, and here's the same lady sitting at the table in the same position. So it's like, did we just see the ghost, or was she the ghost all the time? That kind of reminds me a little bit of what you were talking about with Swimming Pool. That idea that like, I remember watching that movie, and the reason it was memorable because it left that little bit of ambiguity. I'm like, wait, I don't know what happened, versus like the plot that you said for Swimming Pool, where it's like, maybe there's more there than just the ambiguity. Like Pete, you were saying, like there's this other commentary on youth and maturing and getting older. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, you throw in this Venn diagram of ambiguity. But more importantly, it sounds like it satisfied you, Kristen. Like it gave you what you wanted, or maybe in the best cases, what you didn't know you wanted.
The movie you just described sounds a lot like the movie The Others. I don't know if you ever seen The Others.
Nicole Kidman, 100%. Yeah. And that one feels more in like that. Again, talking about Sixth Sense, like stir of echoes, The Others, in that like, oh, Henry, like wait till the last 10 minutes when we reveal that, oh my God, these people were also ghosts. It's like, oh my God, I never thought about it.
100%. And I think with Swimming Pool specifically, because I talk more about that out of the three, I think the reason why the ending doesn't drive me up a wall is because there is no ambiguity in that story until there is. Mm-hmm. And it's at the very end. Whereas I feel like with David Lynch films, and I feel so bad because I know he's a brilliant man, but I do feel like there's ambiguity kind of thrown in. Tarantino has done this too in movies. And I think when you do that, that confusion starts distracting me, at least as a viewer. And I can't really appreciate the story in the film if I'm confused. And one thing, because I'm an editor, I always have to keep in mind is that every frame counts. If I lose an audience member for a frame, it's very difficult to get them back in. So I have to make sure that every frame counts. And I try to tell my students that, like, if you hold on something a frame too long, they're out. If you don't give them that extra frame they need, they're confused. So I think that when you put something in a movie and it's like, oh, wait, is that the father? Is that the killer? Anything like that. And we're only in the second act or we're in the first act. Now my mind is muddled and I can't even follow. It's not that I can't follow because I'm making myself sound like I'm this Yahoo that can't follow complex stories, but I can't invest anymore because I'm too focused on trying to solve that piece of the puzzle before I can move on. And so by the end, if you throw in a big humdinger of a confusing out story element, I'm gone. And I think that is the difference, because I think Ozon's films are very clear until it's not that they're not clear, but the ambiguity is not there until it is. He puts it in, but he does it in a way that it's more of a conversation starter and makes you think like, wait a minute, what happened? That's the best way I can describe the difference.
Do you think, Kristen, that because of your editing background, that your bar for clarity is higher? Because you know how to technically construct a film, but your bar for ambiguity is lower. I will allow it if you did a good job with the clarity, like Ozon seems to be a good example, but you will not allow it if you didn't do the first job of making it clear.
Yes. I think that probably hits the nail on the head, because as an editor, your job is to be a visual storyteller. It's not about piecing together shots. It's about you're constructing this story. You're rewriting this script for the last time. Well, second to last time. I think music helps and sound, but you're one of the last hands to touch this. And visually, certainly, and story-wise, absolutely, you are the last person to put it together. You are constantly thinking about, does this make sense? In particular, with transitions. One thing most people, writers, directors, actors, don't think about are the transitions, and the editors have to think about it because we are putting every scene together. And I'm not talking about the star wipe or the push. I'm talking about from scene A to B. Do we understand why the character's there emotionally? Do we understand how we got there? And that's our job to do that. So we have to be careful, because if people don't understand how we got there, we failed. And sometimes we don't have options. When somebody writes a screenplay, it can be the best screenplay in the world, but then the director takes it and it's their creative vision. So they're interpreting those words. Now, if they wrote it, it's a little bit different, but they interpret those words. And then the third piece of that is the actors are interpreting the way the director is interpreting the words. So when the editor gets the dailies, we get the footage, all we have to work with is the footage. And I tell students this all the time. As an editor, we don't work with the script. We don't work with anything but what we have in front of us, because it's fine that, Neil LaBute wrote this, but then when Steven Soderbergh got his hands on it and Gwyneth Paltrow performed it, all we have is what is on this computer right now. That's it. So we have to make this story work with that. And it doesn't matter what the intentions were. We only have that. So that idea of not confusing people, it's really important, because that's all we are focusing on. Now, when the director comes in, things will change. And that's why when I see a movie like Muholland Drive, or I see a movie that's very confusing at the end or ambiguous, I never say, oh, the editor, it was poorly edited. Although some people will say that. But because I do that, I know that it's not the editor. It's always the director sitting there saying, let's go back to that, or let's not show that, or let's cut there, or let's extend that. And as an editor, yeah, you creatively contribute, but at the end of the day, it is the director's medium. So you have to go with them. Now, at the very end of the day, it's the producer's rule, because they are in charge of that movie, because they want their money back. And that is why a lot of directors now also produce, so that they can have way more say in it. However, we don't ever want to do anything that's going to make the audience feel like they're alienated, they're confused, they don't understand why we just saw that. Wait a minute, do I need to remember that? We just want to construct something so that they watch the story unfold and they don't even notice that it's being cut. And that's the whole thing about people noticing when a clock changes, and then, or it's a pancake and then it's a croissant and it's a pancake. But the thing is, I don't ever, and this shocks people and it shocks students, as an editor, I don't focus on anything with continuity. I focus on the emotion, and you should, because if the emotion is good enough, no one's going to notice those little production continuity errors. And I promise you, that's why I didn't notice those flags in Oppenheimer, because I was so enthralled, especially in that scene that they're talking about, that I didn't for 1 second worry about anything but what I was feeling.
I like how you brought in American and French cinematography together by talking about pancakes and croissants. Just have to say, that was genius.
That's schism right there.
That's right. And that's the end of part 2 of our conversation with Kristen Webster. Make sure to tune into part 3, where we continue talking about movies with ambiguity, and we get into movies like Night of the Living Dead and John Carpenter's The Thing and more.